to Dr. Ian Church.
Thank you so much, Dan, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And yes, one of the books I co-authored is on intellectual humility, and I take a tremendous amount of pleasure in telling people I'm an expert on intellectual humility. So it's great to be here. A few things I want to do before we get started is I want to thank some folks. Justin Barrett has been a longtime friend and mentor for me. He's a psychologist. Obviously, empirical work is not a natural environment for philosophers these days, and so it's good to have a buddy. And Justin Barrett has been my science buddy in doing some of this research, data collection, data analysis, and all that stuff. So I'm enormously grateful to him. I'm also enormously grateful to Rebecca Carlson and Isaac Warchel. They're two of my research assistants who worked with me closely on this project. Without their help, this wouldn't be what it is. Though I feel like I should say, for any sort of mistakes that you might find along the way, those are all mine. But anything that's good that's coming out of this is truly a result of their input. Again, I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for their support, which made this possible. And finally, I'd like to thank Hillsdale College for their generosity and support for me in this project. So the game plan for today is to first of all tell you a little bit about what experimental philosophy is, right? Because that might be a strange group of words that might not be entirely familiar to you. And so I want to say a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about experimental philosophy. And the next step is to think about how that might apply to something like philosophy of religion. And for this lecture, we'll be focusing primarily on the problem of evil, which is fun. But we have, with this grant, we've got $6 $250,000 subgrants that we've doled out. We've got teams all over the place doing research on experimental philosophy and the cosmological argument, experimental philosophy and free will and foreknowledge, experimental philosophy on religiosity and analytic thinking, lots of stuff going on. But our local team at Hillsdale has been primarily focused on the problem of evil, so that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll give you a quick summary of the research that we've been doing thus far, though this is all happily published, right? Very excited about that. And we've been doing some follow-up research along the way, and you'll be happy to know that our findings are replicating, which is the dream to see that. And we've been able to test some objections that you should have along the way, right? So we'll be talking about some, as I'm giving the presentation, there'll be a few points that I'll highlight and say you should be worried about that, right? And we'll talk about how we've tried to address that worry in subsequent research. And then we'll talk about conclusions and future goals for this project. Okay, so what is experimental philosophy? Well, so what I want to do is give you sort of three levels of explanation, right? Most broadly, we might think about experimental philosophy as taking the tools and resources of psychology and cognitive science and bringing them to bear on issues within philosophy towards genuine philosophical ends. Okay? Taking the tools and resources of psychology, cognitive science, the human sciences, if you want to think of it that way, and bringing them to bear on questions within philosophy towards genuine philosophical ends. Now, I want to say that in many ways, this is nothing new, right? I feel like I should also add, that's an important caveat to make at Hillsdale, right? Hillsdale loves its tradition, and so whenever I'm trying to sell this to the administration at Hillsdale, I say, look, we need to make sure that you know this isn't anything new. Aristotle would love this kind of thing, right? That's the pitch, right, that Hillsdale loves. And because in many ways, philosophers have always been deeply interested in looking at the world while being closely engaged with the sciences. And here I'd like to quote Joshua Knobe and Sean Nichols' excellent article, An Experimental Philosophy Manifesto. I'll just go ahead and read the first part of this. It says, it used to be commonplace that the discipline of philosophy was deeply concerned with questions about the human condition. Philosophers thought about human beings and how their minds worked. They took an interest in reason and passion, culture, and innate ideas, the origins of people's moral and religious beliefs. On this traditional conception, it wasn't particularly important to keep philosophy clearly distinct from psychology, history, or political science. Philosophers were concerned in a very general way with questions about how everything fit together. The new movement of experimental philosophy seeks to return to this traditional vision. Right? And so, it's a relatively recent development within higher education that we've sort of hyper-focused on disciplines, compartmentalizing people into their different fields, whereas for many, many years, it was a commonplace for philosophers, the leading philosophers of the day, to also be scientists, right? And so we're returning to this traditional vision of what philosophy is all meant to be all about. And it's also worth noting that a lot of contemporary philosophy is not doing that, right? A lot of contemporary philosophy is wanting to think deeply about the human condition or human nature, the world around us, but they're doing it from the armchair, right? Doing it from their offices, which is nice, right? Saves on research funds. And so in many ways, experimental philosophy is kind of revolutionary in that regard, in saying that contemporary philosophy, which has sort of drifted away from this traditional vision, should come back into closer dialogue with what's going on in the sciences, right? So we'll see a little bit of that going on here too. Another sort of layer of explanation to give when it comes to experimental philosophy is to tie into different responses to the crisis at the beginning of the early modern period. Okay, so when I'm teaching early modern philosophy, I typically like to explain that it was born out of an epistemological crisis, right? A crisis about how we know things, what we know, who we can trust, all these kinds of things, right? And so we have problems at this time about what should we do when faced with a peer disagreement, right? That is a disagreement where you are disagreeing with someone who is your peer, who is every bit as intelligent, informed, availed of all the relevant information, so on and so forth, right? Because you have quite a few of those, both in the early modern period and now. And so should we sort of moderate our beliefs, become more agnostic if we're finding ourselves disagreeing with someone who is equally intelligent but disagrees with us? Or is it okay to remain sort of dogmatic, even if, again, you have no reason to think that your interlocutor is any worse off at engaging with evidence than you are, right? So this is it's a deep puzzle. I won't sort of linger on it, but it's a vexing problem that's still with us today, and it was definitely around at the early modern period with the Reformation, all sorts of religious disagreements and religious wars that are raging across Europe at that time. So the problem of disagreement was very much on people's minds. We also have intellectual challenges at this time that are being brought about by the rediscovery of ancient texts. Right, as Constantinople fell, many Byzantine scholars fled to the West and reintroduced the West with literature that had been largely forgotten. Ancient Pyrrhonianism, ancient forms of atomism are being rediscovered and are being printed and redistributed and having a dynamic effect on the intellectual life of Europe at this time. And you also, of course, have the intellectual upheaval that was brought about by the scientific revolution. And along the way, you have a deep worry amongst many folks at this time that the world, as it's being presented to us by science, is noticeably different from the world as it sort of straightforwardly appears to us. Right? There seems to be a gap, we might think, between the world of science and the world of our appearances, and that can be sort of disconcerting as well. Right? So that's the crisis, right? Just feel the crisis with me. Okay? Well, so in response to that crisis, you have different approaches. Here being, I'm using Descartes and Locke as our archetypes, if you will. Now, in response to that crisis, Descartes decides to clear the table, right? He wants to doubt everything that can be doubted, not just for funsies, right? He's not just because he doesn't like these things, but he wants to find what we can be absolutely certain of, right? So he wants to doubt everything, find what we can be absolutely certain of, and try to build from there. But Locke, importantly, takes a different approach, right? He tells a story about being at a dinner party, everyone's disagreeing, and no one's sort of making any progress. This kind of the epistemic crisis is looming large in the story. But instead of just casting doubt on everything, Locke's proposal is to reflect deeply on where our ideas come from, right? Locke, and subsequently you have figures like Hume, will almost sound proto-psychological in their philosophy, right? They ask you to reflect on where your ideas come from. Do you have any sort of impression that can lead you to that idea? Or do we have some instances where it seems like we are talking about something we actually have no idea about, right? Maybe there might be some domains where our faculties are not meant to tread, right? That's part of the conversation that's occurring in the early modern period. And we might think about experimental philosophy as also being a part of that sort of Lockean tradition, reflecting on the cognitive mechanisms that underwrite our philosophizing. Okay. Fine. So this is some of the history, right? So I'm wanting to give you the sense that this work in experimental philosophy isn't brand new, but how does this operate today, right? What does this look like when it comes to contemporary philosophy? Well, as you might have guessed, philosophers are kind of a weird bunch. The way, some of the methods that philosophers employ might seem strange to us, right? And so it's still pretty common. It was certainly more common when I was in grad school, for philosophers to trade in thought experiments, okay? And so roughly what this would look like is that a philosopher would dream up some sort of thought experiment that's meant to elicit a certain type of intuition, and then we build our theory downstream of that intuition. Okay? Let me give you a quick example of how that might work. All right, so this is a picture of a barn, as you can tell. And let's say this is a famous thought experiment by Alvin Goldman. It's called the fake barn scenario. And so let's say I'm driving through the Michigan countryside with my youngest son, and for his edification, I'm pointing out different objects on the horizon. So I say, look, son, there's a silo. Look, son, there's a tractor. Look, son, there's a barn. Now, unbeknownst to me, now, as an aside, whenever you hear the word unbeknownst, that's telling you you're in a philosophy thought experiment. Okay? So unbeknownst to me, I happen to be driving through a part of Michigan where the Michiganders are particularly proud, right? And they want to appear more well-off than they really are. And so what they do is they construct lots of barn facades, right? And let's say in this area, 9 out of 10 barns are actually facades. But as it happens, as I'm driving along the road with my youngest, I say, look, son, there's a barn, and I happen to be pointing to a real, honest-to-goodness barn. Okay? Do I know that that's a barn? Right? That's the question. And the response is meant to be, well, it's our intuition that I don't know that that's a barn, right? In general, you'll be happy to know I'm pretty good at judging barns. But in this area, right, all bets are off, right? We have all these barn facades in the area that are making me less able to identify barns from facades. Right? And so it's meant to be our intuition that we don't know that that's a barn. Okay? You see what's going on here? We have this thought experiment. You're meant to have this intuition, and now we go on to construct an epistemology, a theory of knowledge, based off of that intuition. Happy days. We're off and running. So, but let's say we're presenting this sort of thing in a philosophy conference, which you might very well do. Here's the sort of annoying thing that can happen. Right? You work through your paper, you give your thought experiment, you try to elicit a certain type of intuition, and then someone raises their hand, back of the room typically, it's always the back of the room, right? And they say, I don't share your intuition. We're kind of at an impasse here. So what the speaker might do is say, well, okay, let me re-describe the situation for you. Right? Try to tell it another way. Like, do you have the intuition now? Right? If you don't, then we just might get frustrated. And I found this meme to capture it, right? When your audience doesn't share your intuitions, but you know you're right, the table pounding intensifies. Right? That's all you can do at that point. You're sort of at an impasse. You don't know how to talk to each other. You have this intuition. You're supposed to have this intuition too. We can't do the theorizing unless you have the intuition. Okay. Well, this is where I think experimental philosophy steps in commonly in a lot of the contemporary literature, because they're really interested in this kind of methodology that philosophers were using. Right? Because philosophers would frequently trade on these thought experiments and say it's our intuition that such and such is the case, but then they would say, well, experimental philosophers would want to say, whose intuition is this? Right? Is it the case that this is an intuition that everyone genuinely has? There are some of those, right? There are really interesting examples of philosophical intuition that seem to be really stable across all demographics. But a lot of other intuitions vary pretty wildly. And if they do vary wildly, right, maybe these are the intuitions of admittedly strange philosophers. And most normal people don't have those intuitions. do we have any reason to prefer the intuitions of these strange philosophers over other people? Maybe we want to make that argument, but if we don't have any reason to think that we should prefer some people's intuitions over others, then maybe that should encourage us to be more cautious about building philosophical empires on these kinds of intuitions. Okay? So experimental philosophers did a lot of work focusing on intuitions, thought experiments, how common those intuitions are, so on and so forth. But I think there's another kind of broader project that they're trying to take on. And this is trying to help us ground our philosophical methodology. Okay, I'm going to try to explain that a bit more. So philosophers throughout history have done their philosophy in such a way that they've tried to ground it in reality, that it's reliable, that we're doing something in philosophy that's describing the way the world is. Right? And there's lots of different ways philosophers have tried to do this. Right? Aristotelian nous might be one example. The way Plato sort of used memory or remembering things is another way of sort of anchoring some of his philosophizing. The rationalists use innate ideas. We don't need to worry about the details here, but the idea is that we need to figure out some way to know that our philosophy or our philosophizing is in reality somehow, not just drifting on our own intuitions. And so a lot of experimental philosophers have started to explore if there's any work that can be done, empirical work that can be done, trying to figure out sort of the cognitive genesis of our intuitions, right? And if that can tell you anything about their veracity or the reliability. Because there are some intuitions, like I said, that are pretty stable across all people, and they seem to have cognitive mechanisms that we might think of as deeply reliable. Other philosophical intuitions might be deeply unreliable, and I can give you some examples about that maybe in Q&A, if that'd be helpful. So we need to look at the cognitive mechanisms underwriting our beliefs to, again, hopefully ground our philosophizing. So this is one of the hopes of experimental philosophy, is to try to answer some of this grounding problem as well. So experimental philosophy, very, very broadly, taking the tools and resources of the human sciences, psychology, cognitive science, bringing them to bear on issues within philosophy, right, towards genuine philosophical ends. We talked about how this has deep roots in the Western philosophical tradition, going back to the homeboy Aristotle, on through Locke, and then we talked about how this gets manifested in the contemporary literature as well. So how is philosophy of religion going to fit in here, right? We've talked generally about experimental philosophy. Hopefully you have some sense about what's going on there. How is that going to be applied to philosophy of religion? As it happens, experimental philosophy has been flourishing in lots of other domains, right? It's been flourishing more recently as a new sort of development in the field for the last 20, 25 some odd years. But it's been focusing primarily on issues within metaphysics or epistemology, ethics, sort of looking at our intuitions in those domains, but it's been very slow to show up in philosophy of religion. So part of what this project is doing is trying to extend the reach of experimental philosophy to philosophy of religion. So I think it's probably easiest to see what exactly is going on with experimental philosophy of religion by looking at an example. Let's consider this argument. This comes from William Rowe's wonderful, genuinely wonderful article, The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, 1979. Truly an excellent bit of philosophical writing, if you ask me. Humble, but very, very clear, great work. And it's the most cited formulation of the problem of evil in the contemporary literature. So the argument goes like this. Premise 1, there exists instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Okay. Premise 2, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Conclusion, therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. Okay. So this is a valid argument, right? And I feel like Dan was trying to make me feel more at home because he happens to put my absolute favorite logic textbook right behind me here. So if I ever feel anxious, I just cast my gaze to my favorite logic textbook and everything feels right in the world for me. But this is a valid argument, ladies and gentlemen. And what that means is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Right? If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And so if we can demonstrate those premises are true, then we are forced to believe the conclusion follows. So that's part of what Rowe is after here. Now we can simplify the argument a bit here, and I think this will serve our purposes just fine. Rowe simplifies it in this way as well, though he doesn't number it out formally like this. But essentially, premise 1 is saying there exists pointless suffering, right? Suffering that's not bringing about some greater good, preventing some sort of greater evil. Premise 2 is essentially saying if there's a God, then there won't be genuinely pointless suffering in the world. Therefore, there is no God, right, traditionally conceived. Okay. Fine, right? That's a classic argument, very, very popular within the philosophical literature, and as I said, the most cited formulation of the problem of evil. So how does this work, right? So Rowe takes premise 2 or 5, right, that if there's a God, there won't be pointless suffering, to be relatively uncontroversial. Right? He gives some arguments for it, but that's not his main concern. He thinks that theists and atheists are going to agree that if there's a God traditionally conceived, then there won't be genuinely pointless suffering in the final analysis. Okay, fine. So remember what I said, though. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, right? So we're already granting this one premise, that premise 2 is true. So that means everything is going to hang on premise 1 or 4, right? That there is pointless suffering. So why should we think that premise 1 is true? Why should we think that there are genuinely instances of pointless suffering in the world? Now, there's lots to say on this, but one of the things that Rowe points to is a thought experiment. Okay. He doesn't include the image. That's my addition. So he gives this case, which I'm calling Bambi. He says, in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. Right? Okay? It's dark, I guess, but we're at a talk about the problem of evil, so we got to do something like this, right? Okay, so he gives this sort of thought experiment. Right, and you should probably guess the drill, how this is going to go. Now, he doesn't think this amounts to a proof. Right? He doesn't think that we know that the suffering of Bambi is pointless. Right? That's not what he's saying. Because he's wanting to grant that for all we can tell, there is some sort of greater evil that allowing Bambi prevents. Or perhaps there is a greater good that allowing this Bambi case affords. Right? Maybe. But the problem, as Rowe sees it, is that given our experience and knowledge of the variety and profusion of suffering in our world, it seems like evils like those manifested in Bambi are wholly avoidable and more or less pointless. Okay. And while the target argument doesn't amount to a proof, it does, Rowe thinks, provide rational support for atheism. That it is reasonable for us to believe that the theistic God does not exist. Okay, so let's work through this just a little bit more. So essentially what's happening here is we have this thought experiment about Bambi, and Rowe wants us to think about that and reflect on what the point of that suffering might be, right? And Rowe wants us to think that, upon reflection, we don't know what the point of the suffering is going to be. And showing my cards, I don't know. I have no idea what the point of that suffering is going to be, right? Maybe there is a point. Maybe there is a point, right? He grants that. But if I don't know what it is, then that gives me some reason, he thinks, for thinking there isn't one. It's not conclusive, but it gives me some reason for thinking that there is no point if I don't see a point. Okay? So my inability to see a point is some evidence. We can talk about how strong that evidence might be, but my inability to see a point gives us some evidence for thinking there is no point. And if I have some evidence for thinking there is no point, then happy days, depending on your perspective, I have some evidence against theism, right? If you're Rowe, happy days, right? Okay, that's the evidence that Rowe is wanting to give us against traditional brands of theism. Right, so far so philosophical, right? Not terribly empirically interesting just yet. But let me just highlight a couple empirical questions that might have philosophical salience? First of all, I mean, this is the standard X-Fi game that they play. Is it the case that Rowe's assessment of the apparent pointlessness of the Bambi case is going to be shared across many demographics, right? So when philosophers talk about our intuitions about the fake barn case or something like that, they assume it's the intuitions of everybody, but experimental philosophers want to step in and say, well, whose intuitions are they really? So similarly, when Rowe is talking about our experience and knowledge of the variety and profusion of suffering in our world, we might also wonder whose experience are we talking about? Whose knowledge, right? Or when Rowe says, it does not appear, it doesn't seem reasonable to believe that there is some greater good so intimately connected to the suffering of Bambi that even an omnipotent, omniscient being could not have obtained that good without permitting that suffering or some evil at least as bad, we might plausibly ask, does it appear or does it seem that way to everyone? Okay? We might have some reason to prefer some people's intuitions over others, right? We can still have that conversation, but it's helpful to know if there is variation when it comes to these kinds of intuitions. Because if we can't tell some sort of story about why we should prefer some people's intuitions over others, then that might make us less cavalier about relying on those intuitions when it comes to doing our philosophizing. Yeah? See how this is working? Ah, good. Well enough, I hope. Fine. Another question we might ask. This is sort of a fun, more fun, I think. Does it matter that the animal in the case is a fawn? Okay? Because that seems telling, right? We're not talking about an adult deer. This is a fawn, right? Doe-eyed, big-eyed animal, ultra cute, Disneyfied, right? That's why I put the picture of Bambi. This is an ultra cute critter, right? So whereas if we ran the same thought experiment with a rattlesnake, we think, yeah, good. Right? Would that change, right? Does cuteness have an impact on our assessments about the pointlessness of the suffering? Because if it does, then that might make us question the veracity, the reliability of those intuitions, if cuteness is what's driving it. Okay? So what if we ran the same thought experiment but with a boar? Right? Or what if we ran the same thought experiment but with a vulture? I didn't go with a rattlesnake because I didn't feel like rattlesnakes had the same capacity for suffering. Which was yeah, we can talk about why that's important. But anyway, vultures are again, I did more research on this than I probably wanted to, but vultures are surprisingly intelligent, right? They make tools. Anyway, what if we put in a boar or a vulture? And what if we try to ratchet it up a bit, right? What if we included an image along with the thought experiment, right? And I went online, and I promise you, I did my level best to find the cutest picture of a fawn I could. So I'm giving participants, some participants the fawn picture. Ultra cute picture of a fawn, okay? And then I went and tried to find, frankly, the least flattering picture of a boar I could, or the least flattering picture of a vulture, just trying to ratchet up, right? We gave lots of different variations of this, but in some instances, give them the worst case scenario in terms of cuteness or lack thereof, okay? It's another empirical question that matters here. And again, it's an empirical question that seems to have philosophical relevance. Finally, we might wonder if context matters, right? Many theists, in response to Rowe's thought experiments, might think, well, yeah, sure, this thought experiment, like the Bambi case seems pointless, but that's because it's ripped out of any broader context. All we have is two sentences, Bambi's suffering terribly, dies, what's the point? And the response of a theist might be, well, of course it seems pointless, because points are found in the context. And so the theory, the hypothesis here, might be that if we give people some context, then the perception of pointlessness will diminish substantially. Right? These are all empirical questions that seem to have philosophical relevance. Right? This is experimental philosophy of religion at work. Happy days. Okay? Now we had a number of hypotheses. Just for the sake of time, I don't want to I don't want to linger on these too much. But we thought that men would be more likely to agree with Rowe than women because, as it happens empirically, one of the best predictors of atheism is testosterone, right? Make of that what you will, but nevertheless, that's what we find in the literature, right? So we thought men would be more likely to agree with Rowe than women. Also, there's empirical research that shows that generally, the more educated people become, the more likely they are to be atheists or agnostics. So we thought the more educated they become, the more likely they're going to be agreeing with Rowe. Fine. Nationality, we thought that Americans might agree with Rowe more than other nationalities. We thought, given that Rowe was working within an Anglophone academic world, a world that has historically been predominantly populated by people of European descent, we expected that people who identified as white would on average, be more likely to agree with Rowe. And of course, we also thought atheists and agnostics would agree with Rowe far more than other religious groups. We thought cuteness would matter, right? We thought the intuitions would be much, much sharper, or much more likely to agree with Rowe when you have a fawn, and maybe even more so when you have a picture of a fawn, and then they would tank when you have boar or the picture of the vulture or anything like that, right? And we thought context would have an important role to play. Now let's talk a little bit about methods. I'll walk through this very, very quickly, and forgive me because I am still a philosopher trying to describe empirical methods. But essentially we had 1,506 participants that we were surveying using the resource called mTurk. It's a data collection service through Amazon. You should have some anxieties about that. If you know anything about mTurk, we can talk about that if you don't have anxieties. But anyway, and so 1,506 participants gathered by mTurk. We had to vet them, make sure they were actually going to be giving some decent data. Had lots of people who didn't pass attention checks, so on and so forth, right? But we essentially sorted them into two groups. We have high context and low context groups, right? So one group got a context where they are talking about forest fires, when why they occur, and then they're given the thought experiment, and the other low context group was just given the thought experiment from Rowe, with modification, either fawn or vulture or boar, okay? And then we have each one of those high context, low context groups was put into 6 other pots, and essentially what the letters down here representing are fawn, no picture, fawn, picture, boar, no picture, boar, picture, fawn, vulture, so on and so forth. You get the deal, right? So high context, sorted into those, off and running. Okay. So how did we measure agreement with Rowe? This is another thing you should be worried about, right? Worries should be coming up at this point. So after giving them the vignette, we asked participants to rate several statements that were designed to assess their agreements with Rowe's intuitions. The first one, it just says the story you just read is an example of pointless suffering. Right? That's sort of just using straight from the terminology that Rowe used himself. But he's using pointlessness as a shorthand for not bringing about sort of greater good, not preventing greater evil, something like that. And then, next sort of items are some equal or greater evil could have been prevented because of the situation in the story. Some equal or greater good could have been accomplished because of the situation in the story, so on and so forth. They had a 7-point Likert scale filling out these questions. As it happened, we'll sort of summarize very, very quickly here. That first question is doing something else, right? When people think about pointlessness, they're not thinking about pointlessness in the same way that Rowe is, in that sort of technical sense. The second and third items played really nicely together. Right? Empirically, that's sort of my hand wavy of saying, empirically, they seem like they're going together in such a way that we can sort of use that as an index. Okay, so we use those the second and third item as our index for measuring agreement with Rowe. And again, you should have worries there, and we talk about those worries later on. Okay, so what do we find? So what we're seeing here might be very small. So we had this, like I said, 7-point Likert scale, 2-item index. The midpoint between agreement and disagreement with Rowe is at 8. Okay, anything above 8 is registering as agreement on average. Anything below 8 is registering as disagreement on average. Okay, so one of the things that's going to be really striking is that very, very few people end up agreeing with Rowe. Very few people. Right. There are other formulations of the problem of evil that ride people's intuitions much, much better. We can talk about those as well. But Rowe's formulation just doesn't seem to resonate with most people. But contrary to our expectations, males were far less likely to agree with Rowe than females. Okay, and we're doing sort of follow-up research right now, trying to figure out what on earth is going on there. Right? Because as I said, testosterone is a great predictor of atheism, and here we have our male participants registering far significantly less agreement with Rowe than women. Education. This was another surprising one. I really like this graph, right? It's a nice little progression. Because we expected that as you get more education, you're more likely to become atheist or agnostic, which has been shown in literature. But here, we see this really nice progression that as people become more and more educated, they find Rowe's reasoning far less persuasive. Okay? In a nice incremental sort of stepstone kind of way, right? The more and more educated someone becomes, the less likely they are to agree with Rowe's intuitions. And it's only the least educated who end up having Rowe's intuitions, right? So that's sort of a surprising result. I don't know what's going on in Brazil. Something crazy. So Americans, on average, disagree with Rowe, but they are more sympathetic, certainly, than Indians. Right. So there's more follow-up research that needs to be done about what's going on in India. Right. So what sort of perspective are they bringing to their assessment of the suffering of the fawn that's causing this really dramatic shift? Brazilians, on average, are sort of middling, but certainly more comfortable with Rowe's intuitions than Americans are. So, like I said, I don't know what's going on in Brazil. That's sort of driving it that direction. What about ethnicity? We do see significant differences across different ethnic groups. Whites and Hispanic people are more likely to be, again, everyone is disagreeing with Rowe on average, but there's a significant difference between how, say, white participants answered and Asians participant answered. Though that's probably being predominantly swamped by the participants we had from India. Right, so we required everyone to be an English speaker, and that kind of limited where we could get data from. And there are a lot of Turkers, people on MTurk from India. And so a lot of our Asian population is coming from India, so it might be more of the Hindu, broader cultural influences sort of swamping some of what's going on there. Okay, so we do see that variation across ethnicities and religions, as you'd expect, right? Atheists and agnostics, though they agree with Rowe, they're not like wild about it, right? So there's some agreement. You see the difference that you'd expect to see. But not, again, the agreement with Rowe just isn't there. It's not a rabid agreement or high fives all around or anything like that. But you definitely see a significant difference between how atheists and agnostics are answering compared to other religious groups. Protestants are more middling than other religious categories that we were looking at. Again, Hindus, very, very different, right? Had a very different assessment of the problem of evil. All right, of Rowe's formulation of the problem. Okay, got a lot going on here. Let me just walk you through what we have. Right, so we're looking at context and cuteness all at once. Okay, so we have fawn, low context, no picture, fawn, high context, no picture, so on and so forth. Right, being mapped out here. I'll just tell you what we're seeing. Cuteness is not playing a role. Right, I was really surprised by that, and I'm still mildly upset about it. Okay? But cuteness is not playing a role like we thought it would. It doesn't seem to matter if you plug in a boar, a fawn, or a vulture, or have the most, again, I can't stress enough how much I tried to find the least flattering picture of a boar and a vulture as I could. That vulture was gross. Right? It was. It had blood and it was gross, right? So, but it didn't have an effect. Right? It didn't really change people's intuitions. Cuteness is not what's driving people's intuitions when it comes to this case, according to this research. Seemingly, right? But what you can see really cleanly, sorry for moving too much, you get low context, high context, right? Every time you get to that high context point, you see a significant drop in the perception of pointlessness. Okay? Context is playing a really important role in shaping people's judgments about whether or not an instance of suffering is going to seem pointless or not. So why does context matter so much? Well, we're looking into it. We don't really know, right? Lots of things could be going on. Maybe we are pattern-loving critters, and if you just give us more information, we're going to assume there's something relevant there, right? So think about whenever we have a rover landing on Mars and they send back pictures, and then the sort of internet is abuzz with do you see that? Is it an iguana or a face? Right? Because humans love patterns, and if you get new pictures, you'll look at the stuff, the landscape of Mars, and you think, I think that's an iguana. Right? We look for patterns. We're hungry for patterns, and so maybe that's what's going on here. We just give people. I'm going to try not to hit the mic. You give people enough information, they're going to find some sort of context, some sort of point to it. Right? Or maybe the context is just drowning out our lack of a point. Right? So imagine you're a defense attorney, and some particularly damaging evidence has just been put forward for your client. And so you might step forward, and there's not really any answer to it. It's bad. It's looking bad. But you do your best, and so you might step forward and say, sort of tell a bigger story about your client and their life and so on and so forth. None of it is excusing the evidence, but it's kind of burying the evidence. It makes a lot more information, right? You're just trying to distract from what's most salient, right? Maybe that's what's going on here, okay? Or maybe it's really is the case that points are found in context. That's sort of the answer I'm most attracted to myself. Maybe it's the case that context is making salient things we don't know, right? We're talking about forest fires, when and why they occur. Maybe as you read that, you think, oh, I didn't really know that about forest fires. Maybe there's other things I don't know about the fawn case. Maybe, right? Maybe that's what's going on here. But we're doing follow-up research to try to explore some of those issues. Maybe they're broader cultural issues. I think that's really relevant here. But we'll have to look at, wait till we're done analyzing our data for the follow-up research to see what's going on. Okay. So perhaps what's most striking from all this research is the fact that so few people ended up agreeing with Rowe's intuitions across pretty much all demographics we looked at. On average, people were disagreeing with Rowe, except for the least educated and the people who were already committed atheists and agnostics. Right? It was really quite remarkable. And we might wonder, right? So there's a couple different conclusions. My official conclusion is this minimal conclusion, right? This kind of empirical research at least raises some important questions about the ultimate success of Rowe's seminal formulation of the problem of evil, right? Maybe the mechanisms that are underwriting that intuition are not as stable or reliable or theory guiding as it should be, right? But that also leads us to the more ambitious conclusion, right? This might give us reason for undermining the most cited formulation of the problem of evil in the academic literature. Maybe relying on these intuitions is a mistake in this instance because we are seeing some indicators that, again, that the mechanisms that are underwriting them may not be reliable. They might be the products of all sorts of other background information that may or may not be salient when it comes to the veracity of these intuitions. Another point I didn't get to mention, just with the graph as well, I'll mention it in passing because I do think it's really interesting. We also asked people how often they hunted or butchered animals, right? And it was really interesting, again, a really nice progression. The people who hunted and butchered animals the most frequently were the least bothered by these Rowe cases, right? Whereas if you or someone like me, where your main experience with meat is in its prepackaged pretty state at the store, right, you might be, and maybe you have sort of the ultra Disneyfied view of Bambi and so on and so forth, right, then you might have the most angst about these kinds of cases, right? So that was sort of interesting. But anyway, it seems like there's lots of stuff going on that inform our intuitions about these cases, and that might give us some reason to doubt the veracity of Rowe's argument. Okay. We'll leave it at that. We'll have hopefully some time for questions. There should be some lurking around. I have questions, certainly, if no one else does. But thank you very much. Yeah, go for it.
Do you have age data?
Yeah, so we did. I don't remember what exactly we found. I think when it comes to age variation, I'm sure if we found any interesting variations there, but I don't have that right on hand. But
the specific graph that made me wonder was the male-female breakdown. I just wondered if there was a difference between age and gender together.
Yeah. So there are many worries about MTurk as a data pool. One of them is it is a bro fest, and lots of far more male participants than female participants. It's also far more atheistic and agnostic than the general population. Right? This is a known problem with MTurk. So we are going to have those issues, and I think let me go back here. I might be able to tell us what the mean age was. I think it was like mid-30s, early 30s. But yeah. Other questions?
As a philosopher,
Oh gosh.
do you park your beliefs way over here in the corner and go off and make these conclusions, which to me kind of sound like they're written from the premise of an atheist? do you park whatever belief system you possess way over here when you go about analyzing all this data and all this stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, the hope, I mean, one way to respond to that is we might think it's just simply impossible to not bring some sort of value judgment to whenever you're doing empirical research, right? That there's always going to be some sort of normativity that's attached to your empirical research. Now, ideally, you are working within a community such that if you are doing sneaky data analysis or you're asking the wrong kinds of questions, that they'll hold your feet to the fire. And so there's a hope that the scientific community won't be marching in lockstep. I think there's actually a benefit, a genuine benefit to having people disagree. And I'll frequently tell my students that they need to value their friendships with people who disagree with them, because those are the people who will call them on their crap, right? Really, right? Because we're terrible at seeing the badness in our own arguments, right? We're terrible at seeing the badness in our own reasoning. And so the hope is that you'll have other people who can point out where things are mistakes, where you've made a mistake, and hopefully make it better. Though I think there's some interesting and disconcerting worries about this kind of stuff, right? So, I've seen experiments before where the team was doing the research and looked like they were getting one initial result, and it was exactly what they were expecting and hoping for, right? And the hoping for is sort of important here. And they were getting ready to high five all around, really excited that their research was panning out. They're gonna have this nice paper, but then they found out the research assistant, the data wasn't actually good, right? The research assistant didn't use the data analysis program correctly, and they just got crap data. And then actually when they analyzed the data again, double checked it, and the results came back very, very different from what they were expecting. In fact, almost against their prior hopes. Well, and it was sort of interesting to watch it from the outside, because now we have to be more careful about what we're seeing here. We shouldn't be too cavalier about the findings that we're getting from this research. But just depending on whether or not the results are going to be favorable or unfavorable, it changed their perceptions on things. And so there's been some really famous empirical studies about, one of my favorite examples is they gave a group of medical students an entirely fabricated medical study that purported to show a link between coffee consumption and breast cancer. Right? And what they found was that, like a lot of the men who generally aren't going to be worried about breast cancer, they're like, oh, who knew, right? They weren't really highly motivated. They read the article and like, who knew? That's interesting. And off they go, right? But it was the female coffee drinkers who were highly motivated to find the problems in the research. And there were serious problems in the research, right? But that kind of motivation is good and a part of the process, right, we might think. Yeah. Does that help? Maybe. Okay.
So maybe to translate that to, as a Christian, hoping that Rowe's argument doesn't hold up, or that there's something problematic in it, that would be like in some ways like the female coffee drinker.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, who are digging in. So and is that a
Well, and we have our referees for the publication that came out. They're not Christians, right, as far as I can tell. But so they're going to be able to point out, where there was a mistake. Maybe we're misinterpreting the data. Maybe our methods weren't particularly good, or whatever. Right? They're going to have an eye for that we may not have. Right? And so I think this is sort of an emergent good property that can come from this kind of a community of researchers. I'm also teaching philosophy of science right now, so this is probably part of my thinking. Yeah.
The beauty is that if he's the God of all truth, then we have nothing to be afraid of, even when our data doesn't.
No, that's right.
When it's bad.
Yeah.
You say, oh, well, let's keep going, because I'm sure
Yeah.
the truth is there's some.
Oh, and there's I think we have to have those kind of conversations, right? We can't shy away from stuff that's disturbing, right? As I said, another formulation of the problem of evil comes from Paul Draper, his 1989 formulation. Intuitions are far more in agreement with Draper's formulation of the problem of evil, right? And so we have to think about, what does that mean, right? And part of what it seems to suggest is that a lot of people's experiences in this world are consistent with indifference, is how Draper's going to think of it, right? Right? How do we want to think about how God sort of fits? What are our expectations about the divine? right? That can be part of the conversation. And maybe we have misguided conversations, right? So John Hick, I think was the one who talked about a sort of hamster god, right? And maybe if we have an expectation of God as if we're his hamsters, where he's going to create a little cage for us, we're going to be fed, watered, we have stuff to play with, right? That's going to give us we might think, a radically misunderstood view of the divine, right? But if God is more concerned about our souls and growing our souls, then putting us in a hamster cage is not going to be particularly beneficial, right? So this this research that can seem challenging from a theistic perspective can lead to, I hope, some helpful conversations about what kind of expectations we should have about the divine. Yeah.
If Rowe started with a premise that nothing can start from nothing,
Yeah.
In that amazing world
Yeah.
must have some creator. I don't know, if he just started there instead of saying, okay, this is evil,
Yeah.
how could a God tolerate evil?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a different starting spot, and would you have a different ending spot if he premised something like that?
Yeah. I mean, so in some ways, Rowe's not arguing against any sort of God, right? But maybe just sort of traditional, because there could still be a creator, right? There could be a deist God sort of setting things in motion, and he's not really necessarily arguing against that. But if we're thinking about a God that's active, has a genuine concern about the well-being of sentient life in this world, that's how it's meant to unfold, I guess. Yeah. Yes, please.
I'd be interested in hearing some of the other, maybe Draper's or other formulations, but I'm wondering, along rather than cuteness, you mentioned the rattlesnake, and you said it doesn't have a propensity to suffer. And so
Right.
there are other kind of qualitative
Yeah.
values of the subject. If we start moving into, say, children,
Sure. Yeah.
instead of an animal,
Yeah.
it's not, no matter how cute or ugly
Yeah,
the child
sure.
is, there's a different level of something,
Yeah.
right? And so, chemical warfare being
Sure.
used on children, right?
Right. Yeah.
That seems much more powerful than a forest fire and bam.
Yeah.
Why, where do those go? I don't know.
Yeah.
Speak to that.
So there's lots going on there, right? And I think part of the reason Rowe wanted to focus on a fawn and not the suffering of a child, which is like there are other formulations that do focus on human suffering, but Rowe is focusing more on the suffering of a fawn, in part because it limits the kinds of other explanations we might be able to bring to bear on it, right? So if we're talking about a child suffering in warfare, there might be issues about free will playing a role in that. Or maybe there's sort of conversations about soul building, right? Even amidst the suffering, beyond our reckoning, there's some sort of broader soul building exercise going on, right? I'm not terribly convinced, but nevertheless, right? That kind of story could be brought into this. It's harder to think about just sort of seemingly a random forest fire, not really free will, right? It's not really firing up free will sensors. We're thinking about a forest fire. We don't typically think about, Bambi heaven and how Bambi's soul might have been improved in any way or anything like that. So he's trying to sort of limit the kinds of suffering that he thinks is going to be most salient given his particular formulation. But I think it'd be, this is another way to sort of empirically explore how people's intuitions might vary depending on the subject matter. Yeah. And when it comes to the rattlesnake, part of what I was after there is, we might think rightly that I think rightly, the relevance or the salience or the significance of the suffering might shift depending on the critter's capacity for suffering, right? So if you step on an ant, there's not as much, it didn't really have the same sort of capacity for suffering as a fawn. So it seems morally different than the suffering of a fawn, even if it's not really articulated. I think just sort of natively, intuitively, people don't fret if they drive over an ant. We probably don't even think about how many ants we drove over on our way over here. But if any of us hit a fawn, we'd be shaken, right? More than likely. And so that's part of why I wanted to look at, a fawn, a vulture, or a boar, because they're going to have roughly, and we did some pre-tests trying to make sure this was actually right, that people had a sort of a similar sense for its capacity for suffering. Some very odd questions. I'm sure that some of our pre-testers were truly puzzled about why we were wondering about a boar's capacity for suffering. But yeah. Yes, please.
You said this was the most widely cited article.
Yeah, formulation.
Discussing the problem of evil.
That's right.
I can't believe that. Well, two things. Number one, you said if A and B are true, then C is true.
Yeah.
But when you use words like pointless, who's to say what pointless is?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then to use as a thought experiment, I was going to make the same point that Dad made. With a non-human
Yeah.
versus a human, that's he's putting God in this tiny little box.
Sure.
With no consideration about how the vast majority of people who have some belief in God characterize him.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, I think that's all sort of, and hopefully this is going to be, revealing some of the broader conceptions or assumptions that are going into how people are thinking about these cases, right? So when atheists and agnostics are more likely to agree with Rowe's intuitions, maybe that's showing that they have a different view or understanding of the divine than Christians of various stripes have. Or thinking about the Hindu example, they have a very different view of the divine than we have. That's seemingly having an important role on how they think about the problem of evil when it comes to this formulation. And they're also remarkably different when it comes to Paul Draper's formulation of the problem of evil. And so there are various things we might say in response to that. I mean, this is riffing a bit off of the data, but we might wonder if some of this can explain broader cultural phenomena. All right, so pretty frequently people will report a view of the world as a more dangerous, scary place than it objectively is, right? Though saying that now, it feels a bit different with all the stuff that's going on in the world. But nevertheless, right, in general, the research has shown that people tend to have a grimmer view of the world than is actually justified. Well, maybe that's in part because of how we consume information, right? So think about how tragedies occur. It's very episodic and often sort of removed from context. And so you hear about some sort of terrible thing that's happening in Gaza Strip, and then there's a commercial for laundry detergent, right? And so just cognitively you're sort of whipped all over the place. But it seems sort of isolated, context removed, and that might, from what we're seeing, that might give you a grimmer picture of the world than is actually maybe warranted. Maybe part of that's going on here. And I think there are also considerations about how we think about suffering and ourselves, right? So I think one of my questions for follow-up research is going to be, is there a big impact in how people think about suffering when it comes to whether or not you have a more individualistic worldview, right? Where you might think, okay, there's my suffering, and I might want to know how God can justify that suffering to me, right? Compared to a more sort of community-oriented worldview, where there might be your suffering, but it's not just you. Like, you are a part of a broader community, and any suffering that is befalling you is going to have relevance, context within a broader community setting. And I think that really might have something to do with how people assess probably what more research needs to be done. Yes, please.
If I understood you earlier, you hinted that some intuitions
Yeah.
are universal.
Yeah, nearly. I mean, people are weird, and so there's.
You can put the right words to that, but I'm curious what finds.
So a lot of intuitions about knowledge, not so much fake Marquez, that was sort of an outlier. A lot of intuitions about knowledge tend to be fairly stable across many demographics. Again, there's a lot of literature on this, and some it gets more mixed results, but it's looking more stable certainly than other philosophical intuitions. And that might be in part because, look, we are a social critter, right? We deeply rely on other people for knowledge, and we're pretty good at identifying who is going to be the bearer of knowledge and who's not, right? Who's making stuff up. So that's sort of, from an evolutionary sort of perspective, you might think that's going to be really, really useful to identify who has good information, who has knowledge, who doesn't. Whereas there are other sort of intuitions that we know are pretty unreliable. Right. So one quick example, if that's okay. So I grew up watching way too much TV, and though I didn't watch a lot of garbage, I watched perhaps a disturbing amount of nature documentaries. Okay, and if you watch a lot of these things, you start to see some patterns, and you become reflective on your own emotional experience while you're watching things. Right. So you might be watching a documentary on the American bison, right? And it's calving season. Oh, they're so cute, they're so wobbly, and the music is high, and it's lovely, right? Very lovely scene. And then the music turns, and the wolves. And oh no, the wolves really got one, and where is God now, right? And so, but you kind of have that kind of response, like, how, this is such a wretched world, that there's such a cute, calf running around and it's eaten by wolves, right? You have that kind of moral outrage. But then if you keep watching your documentaries, and then you're watching a documentary about wolves being reintroduced to the Yellowstone, and they've got puppies, and oh, they're so cute, and they're so hungry, like, hooray, they killed the calf! And so your intuitions can be all over the place, and so those kind of examples might be quintessential examples where our intuitions are unreliable, right? If it's built on that kind of stuff. Yes, please.
Yeah, you were talking about how your research might pose a threat to Rowe's formulation of probability.
Yep.
But the argument about if there's suffering and God can prevent the suffering and he doesn't, there is no God,
Yep.
it's still a valid argument. So what do you mean by saying that it's formulation?
Yep. Yeah. So that first premise seems to hang on for his formulation of it, right? His premise trades on these kind of thought experiments, right? So why should we think that there is pointless suffering in the world? Well, we think about the Bambi case, and if it seems pointless, which it does to me, then that's some evidence for thinking that it is pointless, okay? And if you have some evidence for thinking that it is pointless, and that's your evidence against theism, happy days, right, for him. Okay, that's how the argument's meant to work. Well, what this is proposing, and again, I think my official stance is the more modest conclusion, is saying it raises some important questions that we need to wrestle with. If you wanted to go the more ambitious route, then you would say, well, look, given the type of variety of intuitions we're seeing and how that variety is mapping out, we might wonder whether or not those intuitions that are driving that case, that underwriting that case, are going to be stable enough to weather a philosophical theory. So it's sort of taking the wind out of the sails for why we should think that premise is true to begin with. Right? That's not to say that there aren't other good formulations of the problem of evil, or there might be other ways to recast what Rowe is saying. But just that particular formulation is now, I think, suspect, more suspect. Other questions? Yes, please.
Can you say a little bit more about how in your field intuition, what that means?
Yeah.
Because I'm like, compare it to how it comes up in my field. One of the things I work on is human-computer interaction interfaces.
Uh-huh.
And my students will talk about things that are intuitive to them as if they are self-evident.
Yeah.
And I look at that and say, no, obviously that's because you use an iPhone or something like that.
Yeah,
Right?
sure.
But that's how intuition comes up in my world. So
Sure.
in your world, when you say intuition, where does it come from, or what are the extents of it? Or does it not matter for the experience?
There is so much debate on that.
Okay.
I mean, you've got whole books being written on different proposals or mapping out different theories of intuition. In general, philosophers will sort of trade on the intuitions as sort of saying, this is how the world seems to me. Right? It's a seeming, is sort of the term that gets used pretty frequently here. And it's meant to be a seeming that's going to have some traction for developing theory. But of course, we have all sorts of intuitions that just we know go awry, right? So there's the example of intuitions about the nature stuff, right? But one of my favorite examples to mess with my students is the Monty Hall problem, right? Your initial intuition might be, so very, very quickly, Monty Hall problem, you got 3 doors to pick from, A, B, and C, and you're trying to win the car. There's only one car behind one of the doors. And you pick one of the doors, and then the host thinks around, right, tries to sell the show, and says, okay, well, you want to stick with, and they open one of the other doors that you didn't choose, and it's not a car. Do you want to stay with the original choice, or do you want to switch? Or it doesn't matter, right? And so this, and the host knows where the car is, all this kind of stuff, right? Does it matter whether you switch or stay? Often your intuition is going to be, doesn't matter. It's 50-50 shot at this point. But it does. It matters a lot. You should switch every time. If you switch, you have a 2/3 chance of getting it right. If you stay, you have a 1/3 chance of getting it right. Okay? Puzzling, might be counterintuitive to you, but it's true, I'm afraid, right? And so this is an example of another intuition, just not veridic, right? It's not telling us what's true. And so we have to be really careful about what kind of intuitions are operating here. So short answer is, it's a mess. It's a real mess.
Tie that at all into what I would call lenses like Marxism versus Christianity.
Sure.
So does that count as, if someone says, well, this looks to me like it's because of the patriarchy.
Yeah, right.
Because
Yeah.
I'm a Marxist.
Sure.
Right? So does that, I mean, it doesn't help with the boundary problem, right? But how would somebody in your field distinguish between an intuition and, say, an ideology or a lens?
Well, so this is where, I mean, it's going to be really helpful to see where there's intuition and diversity, right? Because we might look at the world and think that this is just how it is, and it's obvious to me that this is how everyone else is going to see this through this Marxist lens. But then you go out and talk to other people and they're like, not everyone's Marxist. My intuitions might be pretty idiosyncratic and limited to my particular worldview or my peers or whatever, right? And that can be really helpful, I think, for helping us to be more introspective about where our intuitions come from, and so we have any sort of independent reason for prioritizing those intuitions over other people.
So at the level, let's make sure I understand it exactly. So at the level of intuition, it doesn't matter so much where it came from. It's just, to me, it seems that way.
Yeah.
And what you're looking at is that, like you just said, if you get multiple people together to talk about that, they can see that that's not necessarily what it is. It's just what it seems to be.
Yeah, and we might find, and through these kind of conversations, we might find that some of our intuitions, and I don't know how, this is a phrase that philosophers like to use, so forgive me for this, but the phrase they use is that we might find that our intuitions don't cut nature at the joints, right? It's not really describing reality in that kind of way. Maybe my intuitions are just because I'm a Marxist or because I'm a Freudian or whatever the case may be, right? Pick your poison. And so, but then we can have a kind of conversation about where those intuitions come from. Can they be corrected? Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Brandon.
So I recently was reading Walter Ong's work on orality and literacy, and he was talking about some anthropologists who went over to somewhere in Eastern Europe, I forget where it was, but they specifically sought out people who were intelligent, high-functioning adults with normal lives and everything, but they'd never learned to read.
Yeah.
And so they did all these conversations with them, and one of the things they talked to them about was exploring formal logic.
Yeah.
And so they said, hey, in places where it snows a lot, the bears are white.
Yeah.
Sweden is a country in a place where it snows a lot.
Right.
What color do you think the bears are there?
Yeah.
And people would be like, I don't know, the bears here are black.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
There might be some other color in different places. I've never been to Sweden.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one person was like, I can tell you're trying to get me to say that the bears are white.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but everybody's response was, I just invited you to my house, I gave you a cup of coffee, we're having a great conversation. Why are you trying to play these games?
What's the matter with you? Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so the whole point was that even learning to use formal logic and formal reasoning was a game
Yeah.
that they didn't know how to play, and that it was weird that you were coming and trying to relate to them in this odd way to try to play games with words instead of be a real person.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's interesting when I was thinking about that, I was like, all these folks, you're looking at the intuition, it's kind of inherently so because of constraints of literate people.
Yeah.
And so how much does us learning how to read and write and to think in all of these ways that are optional games, for human reasoning,
Yeah.
how much does that color the way that we, the kinds of responses that we even think we're supposed to give?
Oh yeah. 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 Okay. So I'm going to try to conceal, don't feel. I put that down because I love this. I love this. I read Joseph Henrich's work on cultural learning, any of that stuff. Yeah. Okay. It's fantastic. So a lot of Joseph Henrich's work is on what's called a weird psychological profile. Now, WEIRD is an acronym for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And typically, WEIRD psychological profiles, one of the markers is going to be literacy. Right? And it does change how you look at the world, how you engage with it. One of the straightforward ways it changes things is that highly literate people are measurably worse at recognizing faces than non-literate people. Right? So part of your brain that is used to, that gets repurposed, that would otherwise be used to recognize faces, gets repurposed to recognize the faces of letters and numbers and things like that. And so there's a lot of angst over this stuff right now because some empirical research, is suggesting that what we thought of as absolutely bedrock empirical research doesn't pan out when you look outside of weird contexts. And this is part of, so my reading on this is that this is part of the replication crisis within psychology, is that when you collect a lot of data using your students, you sort of build theories based on your students, you're not talking about the world anymore. You're talking about people who are typically weird, right? Literally ends in this special sense. But so just to give you an example, as I understand it, one of the most empirically robust personality measures is called the Big Five. Okay, more empirically robust than anything like the Myers-Briggs or anything like that, right? Really, really well established in the literature. 5 means for personality sort of matrices and sort of look at, introversion, extroversion, openness, sort of stuff like that. You give a Big Five test to a hunter-gatherer group, they don't have a Big Five, right? It is genuinely jaw-dropping to see the results of this. They have maybe a Big Two. But you kind of understand how this is happening, right? If you're in a hunter-gatherer group, there's not really a sense in which you're like, well, I'm feeling pretty introverted today. No, you got to get on with it. You got to. Yeah, that's right.
You better go kill that.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Or that deer.
And that's right. And so, but you're right. Like these kinds of factors are playing a huge role in terms of how our minds are shaped, how we engage with the world. And one of the things that's helpful here is we can see that maybe, it's hard, obviously we're only looking at literate people here, but it'd be great to do follow-up research that's first of all translated. That'd be really beneficial because even the type of language you learn is going to be beneficial or it's going to have an impact on how you look at the world. And looking at non-literate people would be extremely interesting. We have some collaborators in Guatemala and in Colombia that we're going to be trying to partner with, do some more research in those directions. We'll do some translations and get some face-to-face surveys as well.
Yeah, I just think it was fascinating. You're an experimental philosophy guy, I'm a theology guy, so I'll make giant leaps. But the fact that you can go ask someone a formal logic question in a non-literate context, and they go, "Why are you relating to me weird?"
Yeah, yeah.
That's related to the fact that we see something in the world that we don't. Our judgment doesn't intuitively understand as a modern Westerner to go, "There must be a God."
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's like very. I think it's very closely related.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that's really interesting to me is one of my favorite classes to teach is logic, and just to see how fragile our intuitive grasp on logic is. Right? We might think that we're pretty good at it, right? But you can look at what's called a Watson selection test. And, back in the 10 or so years ago on Facebook or whatever, you'd see these quizzes that came up and said 98% of Harvard graduates don't get this right. Right? But it's often a Watson selection test because we're just terrible at it. Even though the logical structure is pretty straightforward. But what's interesting is if you take that same logical structure and put it in another type of context, we get it 100% of the time. It's really easy for us to grasp it. So just the context can matter a great deal in terms of whether or not we can even wield logic appropriately. But yeah, I want to talk some more about Joseph Henrich and his view on the medieval church and how it brought about the Enlightenment. Yeah, we'll talk more. Yeah.
Yeah, heard of them.
Yeah. What's that? Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just an observation / question. So the way you're describing intuition, and with Paul there, when you're discussing Paul, the intuition versus ideology, worldview, what have you, and intuition being embedded in that sort of in our ideologies or in our presuppositions.
It might come downstream of that worldview, right?
Yeah. It might come downstream, and so. You're in a profession where that's acknowledged, and that it's part of your job even to weed those things out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you have any experience or any suggestions on how that can get translated to the general public, or to even other disciplines, right? So many conversations that we end up in, and you're at a school that's going to be more sympathetic towards your particular worldview than many of those maybe that are here that also are across the street.
Sure.
And so, what are ways in which we can say, well, yeah, that's your intuition, and yet that's downstream from presupposition. How do we get the conversation of presuppositions to be more readily had in academia?
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. Well, so look, I mean, and I think it's my understanding, my experience is going to be limited because Hillsdale is its own unique setup, and how I present myself professionally at Hillsdale might be very different from how I present myself professionally in other sort of contexts. And my general stance at Hillsdale is that I don't want students to know what I think. Right? So whatever we're talking about that day, I'll put on that hat and I'll defend that view because I want them to sort of take that seriously. And I want to put it in the best light I can. And I also tell them I'm desperately not interested in disciples. Right? The world is burdened enough with me in it. And we don't need more people who think just like me running around. But I think here, I mean, I'm shooting from the hip here, but I find it particularly helpful to think about the limits of confirmation. Okay. It's really tempting to look out into the world, and if you have a certain perspective, you can find confirmation for it all day. Right? Whatever you want to think. It's easy to get confirmation. It's cheap. Anybody can have it. Right? So if you want to have confirmation that's all Christians are right-wing lunatics, right? You can do that, right? You can have that kind of confirmation. You can chase down that kind of narrative, and you can be sensitive to it and find it wherever you have sort of a lens to find that. If you want to have confirm a view that all liberals are God-hating Marxists, right? You can find that. You can confirm that all day, every day. Confirmation is cheap. Right? If you want to have confirmation that Santa exists, I'm hoping I'm not. Oh, you can do that successfully. Gosh, sorry. So anyway, then you can find that kind of confirmation all day, every day, right? If you want to do that. So confirmation is cheap, and so maybe having a conversation about having a worldview, wielding it, and looking for its confirmation. That's not what you need to be after. You need to be looking out into the world with more of a critical eye. And it's fine, right? You have your confirmations, you have your worldview, but have some sort of sensitivity to where other people might be coming from. And now maybe that comes from dialogue, maybe that just comes, I think it does come naturally from dialogue and conversation. Because you might, as you're talking to someone, just realize inevitably that they have a very different view of the world than you have. Right? And that can be helpful, and it's helpful for them too.
Right.
And so for me, I think it's a lot of it comes down to knowing just how cheap confirmation is, and prioritizing, valuing discussion wherever you can. And I think it's a very dangerous thing whenever discussion is precluded and dialogue is stopped. I think that's where people get more and more ideologically driven.
For sure, and that's where it's like, I think that's one of the goals of what we're trying to do throughout the actual is, and very slow going, and I'm not even sure the best ways of doing it, but somehow getting the types of presuppositional conversations that we have here to translate across the street in profitable ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and for me, I think this kind of empirical research has been really helpful.
Yeah,
Right? I mean,
yeah.
showing my cards a bit, I'm really bothered by the problem people. I really am.
Right.
But it's helpful, I guess. I mean, therapeutic, maybe, to see that for a lot of people, they're not as bothered about this formulation anyway. And so it makes me think, okay, I'm clearly seeing the world in a way that a lot of other people just aren't. Right? Maybe there's something idiosyncratic about how I'm viewing the world. Like maybe, against my best wishes, I have digested some of the sort of American prosperity gospel. Right? Even though I never would want to do that, but maybe it's just sort of in the air, and I might have some sort of expectations about what God owes me. That's made its way into how I think about the world. Right? This can be helpful for me to see that my view might be idiosyncratic, and it's worth sort of looking how other people are viewing the world, and how they view the divine as well. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle for me especially, is that we've been talking about evil.
Yeah.
And so it's I've understood in the past anyway that like an atheist view on what evil is might be different than my view on evil.
Yeah.
Some things might be the same. But what's a struggle is that other Christians are now seeing evil as different
Yeah.
than I do.
Sure.
And so like in this situation right here,
Yeah.
it also pertains to maybe the demographics of, is it rural, is it a city?
Sure, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so someone might see cutting the head off of the chicken as
Sure.
cruel,
Sure.
but in the country, that's acceptable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's right. And I think, you know, for a lot of the philosophers, they're trading in on a problem of evil that has a very maybe idiosyncratic view of evil, where they're thinking about evil merely in terms of suffering. Right? There's not any sort of broader, like they're not factoring in any other sort of value. Right? They're merely looking at good, pleasure, suffering is evil. Right? And that sort of they run with it, right? And in some ways, you know, you kind of understand it methodologically because everyone can get their heads around suffering and pleasure, right? And sort of we're off and running. Right? And it's more complex to think about a more complex and nuanced view of good, including virtue and goodness in general, or beauty, or something like that, right? These kinds of things might factor in to how we think about what kind of world God's going to create. But if we are sort of defining away evil and goodness so that those things don't factor in, then that's going to change how we're dividing these things too. So that all has to be brought to bear. And we're actually going to do some follow-up research on Draper's formulation problem of evil. He, again, focuses just on pleasure and pain. But we're going to sort of play around with putting other things on the scale about beauty and ugliness, goodness and badness, see if that sort of resonates differently with people. Because you might think that there's goodness that comes apart from suffering. And you might even think of some types of suffering as good. Right? I like to go to the gym, and I might suffer a bit from it, but I kind of like that suffering. And there's a certain type of suffering that's not necessarily a bad type of suffering. And so having a more complex conversation, hopefully this literature and this research can push us that direction.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
All right. Thank you. Really appreciate it.